Today we're continuing our conversation about the king of comics, Jack Kirby, as Pop Goes the Culture celebrates Kirby enthusiasm. Today my guest is Danny Fingeroth, a scholar, public speaker, and for some time the group editor of the Spider-Man comics at Marvel Comics. His books include Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, The Stan Lee Universe, and Superman on the Couch, What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Society. Hi, it's David Levin, and we're talking to Danny Fingeroth. And Danny, how long have you been into comics? How old were you when you first started reading?
I've been reading comics all my life, so probably since I was 5 or 6 years old.
And this being the 100th anniversary of Jack Kirby's birth, and people are celebrating the centennial, tell me a little bit about your experience growing up, the first time you sort of were aware of Jack Kirby.
I'd probably been reading Kirby's work without realizing it, but like most people, like many people of my generation, I think when Stan started putting credits in the Marvel books, I became aware that there was a Jack Kirby, although I got confused by the inker concept that depending on who was credited as inking, if it was Dick Ayers or Frankie Ray, Frank Giacoia or Joe Sinnott, that it looked like Kirby, but it looked different, and I couldn't quite, because as a kid, I thought, well, the inker must be the colorist. The inker must be the person who puts the color in.
Right.
So then why did this guy's artwork look different depending on who the color is? It took a while. I mean, eventually I figured out, that the inker was the person who went over the pencil line with ink, and that's why it looked different, because they each had their own style.
Was there a difference for you when you noticed the Kirbys? Like, I know for me, I knew there was a difference between the different Superman artists, and then I saw Kirby stuff, and it was like, especially earlier in the Marvel stuff, it looked a little more primitive than it did later. I mean,
I couldn't articulate it like that when I was a kid. I knew there was. Looking back, the word I wouldn't have used as a kid, because I probably didn't know it, was that it was more visceral. It had a rough, blockier, more in your face kind of quality, and it was more. It grabbed you more. The DC stuff was very elegant in a way, so that's what they strove for, I think.
Gentlemanly.
You'd have, the masters of elegance like Carmine Infantino and Gil Kane and Murphy Anderson and Kurt Swan. I mean, those guys, that was the house style, even if all those guys didn't draw exactly the same by any means. And Kirby was much organic. I don't know what you call it. It was definitely more powerful. It had a more overwhelming effect, which is, I know people both in and out of the industry who found that off-putting, at least when they first saw it, that they weren't ready for it until, they were older. But it grabbed me right away. I was about 9 probably when I first saw the Fantastic Four, and then shortly thereafter, they started putting the credits in. And Kirby and Ditko, the whole Marvel look, Kirby, Ditko, Don Heck, Paul Reinman, those were a different aesthetic. And again, I didn't have the words to put to it back then, but I knew there was something about it that I was looking for without even knowing I was looking for it. And Kirby set the pace visually.
Like a punch in the gut, basically.
Something like that. And also part of it was the printing, actually. If you look at the actual comics, as opposed to later reprints or collections, there's something about the printing quality. I think it was that it was cheap printing. It seemed the printing quality of the Marvel comics at the time seemed to be sloppier and more off register and kind of gummed up. than the DC. And I don't think, I'm sure the original coloring was just as good, if not better, that Stan Goldberg and Marie Severin and so on were doing.
Mm-hmm.
But there was something. Somehow they must have been cutting corners on the printing. So it took on almost a 3D quality. If you look at those comics, the actual comics, as opposed to the reprints, and the fancy schmancy, omnibuy and so on, you can see that. Oh, my motorcycle just arrived. Right?
It's Captain America.
You can see that Ghost Rider must be here.
That's right.
Johnny Blaze is on his way up, so he's riding up the side of the building. You can see that there is a difference in the way the books were printed. And again, there was something about that punched you in the gut or grabbed you by the lapels, or whatever you want to call it. Combined with the writing, the dialogue was certainly different. But as far as the artwork, I'd read Challenges of the Unknown. I'd probably seen Kirby artwork before that, but it somehow didn't stand out to me the way it did in the Fantastic Four, especially.
So why has Kirby earned himself such a place in comic history and comic lore? And I mean, okay, he had great artwork that was different than anybody else, but what was it that made him, as people call him, the king?
Well, it's always hard to say what makes genius or what makes somebody stand out in their field when there's 100 other people or 1,000 other people doing ostensibly the same work. I think Kirby had a vision of the world, the way he saw the world, and he was able to transmit that to the page. I think. So I think, like everybody, he's the sum of his experiences and whatever he was born with naturally. I think also, don't forget, by the time the Marvel comics first came out in the early 60s, he'd been in the business 20 or 25 years. I mean, so he knew all the basics, and then he could translate it into a unique vision, yet still keeping it in the bounds. It still certainly looked real and things looked three-dimensional, and you could follow the storytelling very easily. But there was something about him. I mean, that's what makes any art great or outstanding. Somehow there's a personality behind it that the artist has the skill set to be able to convey it through the art. I mean, that's I don't know how else to put it.
Right. Well, but I mean, you have people like Adams, or you have people like Romita, or you have people like Buscema, or you have Swan, or any of the rest of those folks from a little later than his generation, or Infantino, or Kane, and they all have their own place.
Right.
But Kirby occupies a place of affection. I mean, people have him in a certain spot, and he's created so many characters and so many legends that are raking in billions of dollars in the box office and on TV, even today.
Again, it's just it's a unique vision of life. And I mean, he had, I can go through the litany of the high points of his life that you and a lot of people know, but a lot of people, grew up in the tough streets of New York. A lot of people grew up in the Depression. A lot of people fought in World War II, but they don't all become Jack Kirby. So there's something, innate about him that I think you can't really describe beyond that. I think he was able to process all his experiences and all the people he'd met and all the things that had happened to him and all the books he'd read and the movies he'd seen, and put it through his unique sensibility. And again, he had the skill to then, take that sensibility and draw it on a page. It's, I don't know how, again, that's what made him Kirby. A lot of people had his experiences. A lot of people had their own skill sets, but he had a unique vision that was perfect for the medium and the times he lived and worked in.
Got any favorite characters, storylines things that really hit you growing up?
Well, I always was a fan of the Thing. In terms of Kirby, we're talking. Yeah, I loved Ben Grimm. He reminded me in many ways of my father. I think that was, um, you know, so I think I related. I think that was a lot of what I related to in the Marvel comics in general. Is that the DC characters, the classic thing. The DC comics are very plot driven, but the characters' personalities were fairly interchangeable.
Mm-hmm.
At Marvel, they made they were. I was a New York Jewish kid, and my relatives and the people in my circle were, a lot of kind of New York Jews, along with some Italians and Irish. The classic Godfather mix, right? Um, and so I just related to a lot of that. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know why it appealed to me like that. But the personal conflicts and the character development and the character interaction were very familiar to me. It was Stan and Kirby and taking their backgrounds, peppered with the Warner Brothers movies of the 30s and 40s and Orson Welles' sense of a lot of that whole amalgam of the popular culture of the first half of the 20th century, and they just took it and made it into something new. The Thing was definitely my favorite. I loved the way he was he was built kind of stocky in a way that I remember my father being. Who knows? Maybe I'm totally wrong. And
the way he talked,
introspective and kind of funny, but somewhat cynical and yet hopeful inside. It was, idealistic, but with a literal crust of cynicism and world weariness. He was, one of my favorite. So I love this story in Fantastic Four 3 and 4 where the torch runs, where the Thing basically taunts the torch into leaving, and then they have to find the torch.
Right.
They find the Submariner in the Bowery Flophouse. And then later on, I even wrote an article about this once in the Battle of the Baxter Building storyline, where Doctor Doom takes over the Fantastic Four headquarters. Ben, in a previous story, had become human again, and then Reed has to turn him back into the Thing. And he has this confrontation with Doctor Doom, where he's, doubly pissed off because, A, Doom has taken over the headquarters, and B, he had his chance at being a normal human again, and suddenly he's the monstrous Thing. And there's, I'm sure I'm going to get the quote wrong, but Doom keeps blasting him with the death rays from his gauntlets, and
right.
and Ben or the Thing now, keeps coming. He says, maybe I'm too ugly to die, maybe I'm too stupid to give up. I forget.
Right.
It's great dialogue by Stan and great visuals by Jack, and you just get you get that feeling of, here's this guy, he's so angry and so focused, and yet still can wisecrack like that. It was a magic kind of thing in a way that other comics were not doing. So that's some of my favorite Kirby stuff. I'm sure I could name a dozen.
Millions, yeah. How do you think Kirby would react to seeing his characters on the big screen almost as they were drawn, as opposed to some of the stuff that happened in the 70s or the 80s?
I would imagine he would like it. I guess he'd like some more than others. I guess he would think that some of the filmmakers got what he was going after and that others missed it. I've had that, in a very limited, my little sliver of that has been sometimes seeing stories that I've written or edited end up on screen, and it's an interesting feeling, kind of go, well, that's kind of cool, that I know what we were going after, and oh, look at that, they copied that the framing on that scene is exactly like the frame on. I have my cat in the background.
That's all good. Remember the
Yeah.
BBC guy where his kids ran in the back, so this is all fine.
It was great. So, what was the question?
We're just talking. We're just chatting.
Jack. I
We're
met
gonna have to
Jack.
wrap it up soon, but
I met Jack one time, so
Yeah.
I mean, I can't claim that I knew him, really at all.
right. You know Stan though. Does Stan
right.
speak of Jack at all?
Is he? Stan constantly speaks of Jack. I mean, not necessarily to me, but I mean in public. I mean, he was, he always loved Jack and loved Jack's work. I mean that's, I think, and he always, I mean, I think the artist he always held up for the other artists to model themselves after was Jack. I mean, they knew each other since Stan was a teenager and Jack. There's a 5-year difference in their ages.
Right.
So, Stan had been Simon and Kirby's assistant, and so they knew each other since they were both very young. I think it was a complicated relationship, to say the least.
Hey, look, same thing with Lennon and McCartney. And I always think of those together. Lee and Kirby, Lennon and McCartney. I always think of the 60s and those two creative combos.
That's the nearest metaphor. It's funny, I was just talking the shoe was on the other foot. I was interviewing somebody for, I'm writing this biography of Stan, so I was interviewing somebody for it. And I said, nobody ever says about, like, Lerner and Lowe. That Lerner did everything and Lowe just tagged along for the ride, Nobody ever says, oh, that Oscar Hammerstein, boy, he just exploited that Richard Rodgers, but somehow, or maybe they do, maybe in their business there's like that. Those are ongoing debates. I don't know.
I think part of the problem was, especially with Kirby, but in so many cases of comic book creators not getting, in life at least, or for most of their lives, the kind of credit they may have deserved and the kind of money they may have deserved. And I think to a certain extent, could be wrong, I wasn't there, but to a certain extent, Stan is the butt of a lot of that anger because he's still around.
I mean, I think the only place that you see that anger is on Facebook.
Yeah.
If you go out in the world, there's not that anger. And again, look, Jack was sort of the classic story of the exploited artist. Although again, I think it was more complicated than that, and at different points in his career. But at the point where it became obvious that Marvel's characters were worth so much, and he had not been in for that, and then I think he came to represent, whatever inequities were in the work for hire comic book system all through the decades. So it's, and Stan became the public face of Marvel and does all the cameos, and I think what people forget is that Stan, does not and never has owned any more of those characters than Kirby did.
He filed suit against Marvel himself.
There you go. We sort of see it in one context,
right.
But again, I think there's much more complexity to it, and but right. I think Stan has lived so long that he can then be a lightning rod for everybody's feelings. Right, again, of people who were no more in the room with them when they did stuff than you or I were, as if they or any creative people worked exactly the same on every project they did together.
By the way, just between you and me, Lerner was coasting on Lowe, totally.
I think it was Lowe's mother that came up with Camelot. Originally supposed to be called Lerner Lot.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, Bernie Taupin was the real genius with Bernie Taupin with Elton John. He was the unsung genius.
Lerner and Lowe and Rodgers and Hammerstein, I believe, all four of them went to the same high school as Stan.
Of course they did.
Went to DeWitt Clinton.
That was a big one.
It was.
Wow. One final word on Kirby at 100 years.
I think people will remember Kirby in 100 years. I think they'll remember the characters. Obviously, they'll remember the characters. Those characters are literally evergreen. I think Kirby will be still be a part of the vocabulary. Kirby characters, Kirby Crackle.
Yeah.
I think he may be. He may be, and I think should be. Depending on the character, remembered as Lee Kirby or Kirby Lee, or. I mean I guess the danger really is that history might just remember them as Marvel characters and sort of make the corporation into the brand or the creative force, as opposed to the people who actually created the characters and the stories.
Yeah. Then again, there was an episode of To Tell the Truth where people thought Stan had invented Superman. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, I think despite the fact that we've come a long way with the general population's awareness of the characters and the creators, I think it's still a long way to go.
Well, I'm glad he's getting his credit on screen these days, as are others.
Yep, him, right, and Larry Lieber, Don Heck, all those guys.
Yeah, which is great. I wish they had lived to see some of those guys. Lieber did.
Yeah. Lieber did. Yeah, well, it would be. It would be nice, but better late than never.
I agree. At least his family gets to see it. Danny, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on my favorite medium, internet TV.
Ouch! Ooh.